Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out. It's a beautiful evening. Don't get used to the 60-degree weather. There's a change coming very quickly. And I don't know if it's the polar vortex or some other thing, but enjoy your last day of freedom tomorrow with warm weather. So it's a pleasure to have you out tonight. It's a great crowd, and you're here for a terrific conversation with Professor Alan Wolf and colleagues on his new book, At Home in Exile. My name is Eric Owens. I'm the Associate Director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College, and I also teach in theology and international studies. I'd like to offer a special welcome to those of you watching on the internet. Thank you to our friends at Front Row, including Ben Birnbaum, but all the other staff who makes it possible. A video recording of this event will be available minutes after the live stream closes down. And you'll be able to see that at frontrow.bc.edu as well as bc.edu/Boisi, B-O-I-S-I. I'd like to ask that all of you in the room silence your cell phones before we begin so that we're not interrupted, but you don't have to put them away because we are tweeting this event at the hashtag Jewish Diaspora. So if you have thoughts or concerns, join in the conversation online, whether it's sotto voce during the initial conversation, but we'll be also reviewing that stream of tweets for questions also during the Q&A period. So you're welcome to tweet questions there. You're also we'd also be happy to have you tweet questions to our staffer, Evan Goldstein, evan.goldstein, E-I-N, at bc.edu. I'll mention that again when Q&A comes around. And we'll have staff monitoring social media for questions that we'll ask when Q&A arrives. Alan Wolf's new book, At Home in Exile, Why Diaspora is Good for the Jews, is the latest contribution to a very long and indeed ancient conversation about Jewish exile and return, about the diaspora and the homeland, and about Jewish identity, assimilation, and the future of the chosen people. This conversation has always brought together diverse and dissenting voices, religious and secular alike. But it took on a new weight and urgency in the wake of the Holocaust and the subsequent creation of the modern state of Israel. Today, 66 years after Israel's founding, the United States and Israel are together home to nearly 90% of the world's Jews, and in roughly equal proportion. It makes sense then that a conversation about the identity and the obligations of American Jews is always also, at least in some part, a conversation about Israel. A New Yorker cartoon that popped up in my daily calendar a couple weeks ago captured the spirit of some of these debates. If those of you who have one of these may have seen it as well. It has Moses leading the chosen people through the Red Sea, which is parted behind him, and one of the people following him leans to the other and says, "He's all right, I just wish he were a little more pro-Israel." Alan Wolf's book enters the fray with an argument for a revitalized Jewish universalism, made possible in part by the safety and security of the contemporary Jewish diaspora in the United States. Written in his usual engaging and thought-provoking style, it captures the moment while raising timeless questions. I'm delighted to have such an exceptional panel of scholars to join us for tonight's conversation, and we will have an opening set of comments by Professor Wolf, and then responses from Ben Birnbaum, Susanna Heschel, and Kevin Kenny, whom I'll introduce in turn. Alan Wolf is the founding director of the Boisi Center and professor of political science here at Boston College. He's the author and editor of more than 20 books, most recently, of course, At Home in Exile, but also the influential books Political Evil, The Future of Liberalism, The Transformation of American Religion, Moral Freedom, and One Nation After All. Widely considered one of America's most prominent public intellectuals, in addition to his books, he's also well known for his essays that reframe our understanding of tired tropes or unexamined bits of conventional wisdom. And he is known for his penetrating book reviews. Tonight the tables are turned, and we've invited 3 book critics to speak about Professor Wolf's latest book. First, however, we've asked Professor Wolf to lay out some of the core themes in the arguments that his book makes. So please welcome Professor Alan Wolf.
Well, I'm not sure I can do what Eric just asked me to do because he laid out the themes of the book. So I can only repeat and maybe embellish a little bit on what he said, and I'm going to keep it very short because I'm here to hear the critics, and I hope you are as well. There's an amazingly productive scholar of Jewish life named Jacob Neusner, who's written so many books it's almost uncountable. But in many of those books, he explores what he calls the Judaism of Holocaust and redemption. For Neusner, these two twin events happening so close together, the German Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel, created essentially a secular religion, especially in the United States, a religion that borrowed key elements from Christianity. It borrowed from Christianity a concept of hell embodied in the Hitler's final solution against the Jewish people that was worse and more vivid than anything John Milton could have written about the Christian conception of hell. And then it turned around and offered, in the midst of these horrors, a possible road to salvation in the creation of statehood for the Jewish people. The last 66 years are pretty much my years. I was born in 1942 and was 6 years old when the State of Israel was created. And my life as an American Jew, a non-religious, secular American Jew, was dominated by exactly these two events. More or less everything we did, every aspect of our identity. If you were a wild pessimist, you emphasized the Holocaust, and that Jews were always going to be subject to a Holocaust wherever and whenever they lived, and that the Hitler version was just a prelude to a number of others that would follow. Or if you were a more optimistic person, you would look at the creation of the State of Israel as finally a homeland, finally a refuge, finally a place where the Jewish people could be safe. I love this concept of Judaism of Holocaust and redemption. The only thing I would say about it is that it's essentially a secular idea. It's bound by time. It's temporal. It has events that create a beginning and an end, unlike more traditional forms of religion, which are timeless and never-ending. And in that sense, inevitably, I think we've reached the end of that compelling narrative of joining those two events, destruction and salvation, so intimately together. It's inevitable. The Holocaust will pass. Its intensity will pass. We can protest against that. We can write that we must never forget, that we must always keep it in mind. And I can certainly understand why anyone would choose to do that about an event so horrific. But in an odd way, if we do that, we make the enemy's definition of the Jewish people the very definition of the Jewish people. We emphasize the most negative possible things. We see ourselves as a people that are agentless in modern academic jargon, that have no choice about the kind of lives they will lead. There's a very interesting professor of Jewish studies at Indiana University named Alvin Rosenfeld, who's written about the necessity to keep the Holocaust alive in our consciousness, and he objects furiously to the tendency to generalize the Holocaust as a tragedy for the human race, and he insists that we should view it as a tragedy for the Jewish people. I think that's a hopeless endeavor, whatever one thinks about whether it's correct or not. This will pass. And the founding and creation of Israel as this gigantic event, primarily in the history of human liberation, will also pass. The early founders of Israel were advocates of a kind of almost universal human liberation. The story of Israel was the story not only of the salvation of the Jews, but of the redemption of humankind. And that too, whatever one thinks about it, is passing. Israel is increasingly getting its wish to act like any other nation state in the world and to be treated like any other nation state in the world, no longer sanctified by whatever special status the Holocaust had given to the Jews as a victimized people. Who inevitably, it seems to me, we are entering a new stage in this ever-long history of the Jewish people. What I emphasize in my book is that both of these events, both the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel, put the weight on the more particularist tendency in Judaism than on the more universalist tendency. Particularism and universalism are these terms, they're always thrown about. Lots of scholars have shown that they're fundamentally useless, that you can't really distinguish between them. And all that's true, and yet they're inevitably helpful. There are different ways of thinking about the lessons of the diaspora. You can view the diaspora as God's punishment for the sins of the Jewish people, as the ancient Jews did, as the book of Deuteronomy emphasizes. Or you can, as the Reformed Jews of middle 19th century, the great Reform rabbis of middle 19th century Germany insisted that the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews, rather than being punishment, is an opportunity to spread a universal message of enlightenment and insight to the world as a whole. Those are two different tendencies. They can be blurred and so on, but they are. The Holocaust is particularistic. It singled out Jews. Of course, it singled out others, gypsies and homosexuals, but it primarily singled out Jews for destruction. Hitler was one of the world's great particularists in that sense. And Israel has a particularistic dimension insofar as it singles out Jews for a special status of citizenship that isn't accorded to other of its residents. With the passing of this combined emphasis upon Holocaust and salvation, or Holocaust and redemption, I argue in the book that the universal trends within Judaism are subject to a revival. I think we're going to hear more and more about it. I think younger Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora, are increasingly leaning in that direction. I think it's an enormously positive development, and I especially think it's an enormously positive development for Israel. I'm not an anti-Zionist. I don't want to get into the whole question of whether the creation of the State of Israel was morally justifiable. I think it was, but I think that's really beyond, I hope it's beyond our discussion for tonight because it's been argued out so much. I want to see Israel survive. I want to see Israel flourish as a Jewish state, as a refuge for the Jewish people. But I think the current course it's on is suicidal in protecting that legacy. In the early days of the State of Israel, diaspora Jews were enormously helpful in a financial sense. I believe that in the current situation in the Middle East, diaspora Jews can be much more helpful to Israel in a moral sense, that the universalism that can occur anywhere can occur in Israel and it can occur outside, is more likely to occur outside, and that's what Israel needs more than anything else at the present moment. So I try to write an optimistic book, which is a very difficult thing to do these days when the situation seems depressing. But rather than go into all of the details, I think that that's about as succinct an overview of my argument as I can provide. And I will end on that note and open it up to discussion.
We'll have a chance for Q&A with the audience as well as all of the speakers over time. So thank you very much for this. Our next speaker is Ben Birnbaum, who is known to many of you in the room. He's a special assistant to the president at Boston College. He's the executive director of the Office of Marketing and Communications, and is the editor of Boston College Magazine. He's also an acclaimed essayist, winner of the 2006 Simon Rockower Award from the American Jewish Journalists Association, his essays have appeared in The Atlantic, Harvard Divinity Review, and many other magazines and publications, and has been anthologized in the well-known collections The Best American Essays, Best Spiritual Writing, and impressively, The Best Catholic Writing. That's the big one. That's the big hurdle. He's the author or editor of several books on Boston College history, including The Heights, an illustrated history of BC, and he's the editor of the essay collection Take Heart, Catholic Writers on Hope in Our Time. Please welcome Ben Birnbaum.
Thank you much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank Alan and Eric for inviting me. As is often the case at Boston College, I find myself in the position of the third son at the Seder. Those of you, I see some of you already know what I'm talking about. The wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, and the one who didn't even know what question to ask. I am the simple one. I have no PhD. I do not have the scholarly apparatus that any of the people up here on stage with me have, and frankly, that I know many of you have as I look around this room. So I am going to offer a rather personal response to Alan's book. But first I want to say that, what Alan has done here. I picked up the book with a heavy heart, to tell you the truth. This is an argument. Is diaspora good for the Jews, bad for the Jews? How about Israel? How about the World Series? Everything is about what's good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. It's an argument I've heard since I was sentient. And I I love Alan's work, and I wanted to love this book, and I did love it. What he does here is something I haven't seen. I haven't seen before, and perhaps I haven't read the books. But it's an informed and enlightening text. He boils things down that have been spread out all over the place and brings them together. He's fair to every dog in the fight, as is his wont. I would not have been as fair as he is to several of the people who speak in this book. And as always, he's fun to read. He knows that a straight furrow is a lie. Every furrow he plows has a crook in it, and when you come to it, you're delighted. My contention, if you will, my argument with the book is not about its quality. It's a wonderful book and a necessary book. Not its presentation, which is fair. My argument with the book, or I shouldn't say argument, but what I felt upon reading it and then rereading parts of it, is that it somehow left me cold. That the argument between particularism and universalism did not move me, not a bit. And I will tell you something of my past which may, well, I'll tell you something personal here. I was born into an Orthodox Jewish family, which moved towards stricter orthodoxy as my father got older and moved us with him. The family split in 1970. 3 of my brothers and my father made Aliyah. They went to Israel, and they have stayed there forever since then. My father's buried there. My mother and the 4 of us, there were 7 of us altogether, 7 children, stayed here. My mother made Aliyah later, though not for the religious and Zionist reasons that my father had. She was getting old. She knew her American children would put her in a home when the time came. She knew her Orthodox Israeli grandchildren and great-grandchildren, which were numerous, would always have a place for her in their home. So she made a very, I think, wise and prudent decision to be there and not to be listening to me on the phone saying, "Mom, it's time." I know both sides. I know the Universalist side, I've lived it. I know the particular side, I've lived it. And my family is split, almost down the middle on that. In 1969, I was in Israel for 4 months. I had a job there in a summer camp, but I stayed on. And I worked on a kibbutz. And that was, I will say, a kind of wonderful time to be in Israel. The Six-Day War was 2 years gone. Everybody was singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, which means Jerusalem of gold. It was the anthem. It was on the radio all the time. A nostalgic kind of anthem about coming back to Jerusalem. And they were also singing at the same time another anthem, an odd anthem in retrospect called Sharm el-Sheikh, which is an outpost at the bottom of the Sinai, and which Israel had retaken militarily when it took the Sinai. And the anthem pledged, "We will never leave you, you'll be in our hearts forever, Sharm el-Sheikh." Of course, Sharm el-Sheikh had nothing to do with the Promised Land. It had nothing to do with anything. And when it was a military outpost and a useful one over the Red Sea, and when Sadat made peace with Israel, Sharm el-Sheikh somehow left Israeli hearts and returned, practically speaking. But that was the state of things. Everything was lovely. Everything was beautiful. So it seemed. Plus, I was living on a kibbutz that wanted me to make Aliyah myself and to stay there. And so I won't say they were throwing their daughters at me, but they made their daughters available to me. And in a social way, I want to say that. And one can find uses for underground bunkers that you haven't thought of when you're in a kibbutz. But I left. I made a conscious decision. I stayed almost a year. And I made a conscious decision to leave. One was the hubris. I felt that his hubris began to bother me. It was clear there were privileged people. And they included some Israeli Arabs. They included some Bedouin. They included some Druze. And then there were many who weren't. I had a friend, an absolute American friend, who made Aliyah at the time, and we both went to the old city. He kept parrots. He would go to the old city to buy millet seed. And he walked into a shop in the old city on the Shuk, and he began to bargain with the Arab who ran the shop. And he couldn't get his price. And as he walked away, as we left the shop, he kicked over a 45-pound sack of millet, which spilled all over the floor in rage. And I turned around to look at the face of the shopkeeper. And just past the face of the shopkeeper, I saw about a 10-year-old boy, his son, obviously, sitting there, watching his father being absolutely humiliated and with no... Now, that's a story out of Isaac Babel. That's a story out of every sort of melancholic Jewish memoir out of Eastern Europe. More importantly, perhaps, I was not an Israeli. I was Jewish, and I was at that time still somewhat religious, Orthodox religious. But I was not an Israeli, I was an American. Everything in Israel was foreign to me. Well, I could speak the language, I knew the people somewhat, but much of it was foreign. And in America, I understood everything. If there were 10 smells on a street on Broadway, when I walked up that street, I knew what the 10 smells were, whether they were sour or sweet, whether I should go near them or not. I could hear and see everything. And I could never be anything else unless I went into exile, which I did not want to do. So much for particularism. I've rejected it. It is not for me, and I will not have anything to do with it. I will also say, I need to go back and say that another reason was I had come to reject, though I was raised with the particularism that posits Israel as a chosen people selected by God. The Comanche, I had read, called themselves the humans. That's what Comanche, or their real tribal name, meant. This seemed to me no more justified than that, and I rejected it and reject it to this moment. We are human, and that's it. We are a species. So there's particularism. Now, let me cast my stones against universalism, because it is, I think, a form of particularism, and I reject it. The responsibility of the Jews, let us say, to be a leaven, to be a light unto nations, which is the conclusion you reach if you retain particularism but put God out of it. You're left with an obligation that isn't an obligation to God. You're left with an obligation to man to be godly. Now, that's a wonderful thing, but I don't want to carry that, and I'm not going to carry it. And I have to say, too, that in my life, more than 6 decades, I found a good deal of that kind of the notion of Jews as having a special calling, a leaven, if you will, to be onerous and to be, in some ways, the obverse side of anti-Semitism. I don't say it's as bad as anti-Semitism, of course not, but philo-Semitism is as objectionable to me as a human being and as a Jew. I'm not philo-Irish, I'm not philo-Italian. I have a great regard for Irishmen and Italians. I see a couple of them here. Now, I have to say that there's a way of expressing this. Alan expresses it beautifully. I have a great deal of personal regard for Alan. I've known him a long time. I read him a long time before I knew him, and I found him to be the gracious, lovely person he was in his essays in person. And at the end of this book, he phrases the kind of universalism he supports in a way that I find a hard time saying no to, because it's sweetly put. He says, I prefer Judaism, this is the last sentence of the book, that is special but not chosen, to one that is chosen but not special. Well said. Jews survive best for themselves and for the Gentile world around them when they do more than live, but live up to an ideal. Now, I would say to Alan, so does everybody else. It is not a special obligation to Jews, in my view. Other people say it far more tendentiously, and there I want to bring up Judith Butler, who I abhor. And I have to read this from Alan's book, because I don't own a book of hers and would never own one. Here's what she says to me Well, a literary criticism, I understand, is very good, but frankly, it's pitched too high for me. Alan is quoting her here. I'm trying to understand, she writes, how the exilic, or more emphatically, the diasporic, is built upon the idea of the Jewish, not analytically, but historically. In this sense, she writes, to be a Jew, is to be departing from oneself, cast out in the world of the non-Jew, bound to make one's way ethically and politically precisely there within a world of irreversible heterogeneity. Now, I'm not responsible for her style, but I hope you heard her. I hope you heard what she said. The obligation she's trying to place on me, it's not mine. We had a saying in Brooklyn, and I'm just going to abbreviate the saying. The saying was, F you twice. And that's my response to Judith Wilt's contention that I have a special responsibility. Judith Wilt, my God. Judith Wilt, I'm going to give you a hug. You know I would never say that about you. Judith Butler, that's what I say to Judith Butler. And I'm under no obligation to be the leaven for all of you Gentiles or for all of us Jews. And I don't want to do it. I will say finally, I'm not in exile. I'm not in diaspora. I'm where I was born and where I want to be. And I stand unbeholden right there. That's it.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. Our next speaker is Professor Susanna Heschel. She's the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her research focuses on Jewish-Christian relations in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries, the history of biblical scholarship, and the history of anti-Semitism. She's presently at work, I understand, on a new large-scale project on the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam. She's an award-winning author with books including Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus and The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians in the Bible in Nazi Germany. She's also the editor of a book entitled Moral Grandeur and the Spiritual Audacity, Essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel, the renowned Jewish rabbi, scholar, and civil rights activist who was also her father. Professor Heschel has served as a Rockefeller Fellow at the National Humanities Center and on the Academic Advisory Committee of the Research Center of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She earned her BA from Trinity College, an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And it's such a pleasure to have you here today. Please.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here at Boston College and to participate in the lively Catholic intellectual tradition and activities that you have here. I live right down the road, and I love coming here. And it's a special pleasure to be able to discuss this wonderful new book by Alan Wolfe. I find this book to be an extremely engaging book and a very courageous book, and a book that really says what Jews are worrying about these days. He puts it so well, and he says sometimes what some people are afraid to say. So I emphasize the courage of it. Now, I want to take a slightly different approach from Ben's and not talk so much personally, or perhaps not so much about Israel, but about exile. And what strikes me about the description that Alan presents to us of the state of Jewish debates and discussions and mentalities today is the difference from the way it was, let's say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I'm brought back in reading his book to Portnoy's Complaint. You know that marvelous book by Philip Roth. So Portnoy's Complaint, there's Alexander Portnoy, whose parents are telling him that he has to look and act like a middle-class Gentile, but he has to come home every Friday night and have Shabbat dinner with his family. For Roth and for so many other Jews, there's a pull of tradition on the one side and the modern secular world on the other side. Jews were always told, be a Jew at home, a man on the street. It's an old kind of anthem of the 19th century. But what emerges from something like Portnoy's Complaint, and what emerged in the Jewish debates from the 1960s and 70s and 80s and so on, was the Jews are neurotic as a result. Not normal, not at peace. There's something divisive about living in this exile. It's not strong. There's not a unified commitment. On the contrary. But what Alan describes in his book is a new generation with a very different kind of experience. Jews who share the mostly liberal politics of the United States and European, West European countries, Jews who are enjoying a multicultural intellectual and cultural environment, and most importantly, Jews who feel at home in their Jewishness. Not like my experience once when I lived in Dallas. My first teaching position out of graduate school was at SMU, Southern Methodist University. I taught Jewish studies just for 3 years. But I went to a gym there, and I remember once watching the news, and my aerobics teacher came over and asked me what I was watching, and I explained something about Israel. She said, "Oh, are you?" She didn't want to say the word out loud. She would embarrass me publicly in front of the whole gym. Things have changed. And Alan makes it very clear, things have changed. So Jews really may well be at home, and in fact, not neurotic. So what does that mean? Have we become used to exile because of its long duration? There's been a state of longing for redemption, longing, yearning for something that's inchoate. Sometimes I don't think Jews really know what that redemption means, what they imagine. I don't think we think about it all that much. I think we talk more about being in exile than about what the eventual redemption is going to be. Now, Alan posits that Israel in its existence will be balanced with Jews in this exile, and that Israel's going to listen to us. And I guess that's one of the places where I got a little nervous. Will the state of Israel really listen to us? I don't know. But what Alan also describes is a different kind of exile, which is the exile of the collective Jewish community in our diaspora, in the United States, in Europe. But being in exile from the Zionist politics that dominate and divide us. Zionism is supposed to unite the Jewish people, but there's really nothing as divisive at this point as where you stand politically. One step to the left, you're finished. Don't join that synagogue. And that's what's so disturbing. Is it an exile then from the state of Israel? Is it an exile from Jewish religious piety? Or is it an exile from the oligarchic political structure that's setting a dangerous right-wing political agenda that Jews have to adhere to and that Jewish money is controlling? And that's what worries me. But Alan asks us to consider, are we Jews here in America in exile? Or perhaps is the state of Israel in exile? And I think Ben was alluding to this as well. Is Israel exiled from the Judaism that Zionism, from its outset, said it wanted to negate? Is the state of Israel in exile from the language, from the values, the spirit of Jewishness? Has modern Hebrew become so de-theologized that it doesn't know how to speak of the glory of God, kavod Hashem, the word kavod meaning honor, dignity, but also glory? We don't have a way to express it. In modern Hebrew, somebody asks you, "How are you?" What do you say? Dear. My student, beseder. You say, "Fine, I'm fine, beseder." In Yiddish, what do you say? How are you? What do you say? Baruch Hashem, thank God. We've become de-religionized as a result of modern Hebrew and of Zionist ideology and the political transformation. What's happened to our Yiddishkeit, to our Jewishness, to our values? Avram Burg, who was once the Speaker of the Knesset, has also written that he would rather live in Europe than in Israel because he wants to live in a multicultural society. It offers stimulation and variety. And in fact, hasn't that kind of stimulation been the source of Judaism's vibrancy for the last 2,000 years? Now, in fact, we've been united as Jews in diaspora. It was in the 19th century. It's true that there were Jews in Germany, certain rabbis, in fact, I would have to say also Abraham Geiger, who said that Jewishness is not about diasporic Jewish collective identity, but the national identity. He would only worry about German Jews and not worry about Jews who were in trouble in Syria in the 1840s, for example. But let's think about this. We're in diaspora, there's the state of Israel. Claude Lévi-Strauss once said, it's in the differences that they resemble each other. So perhaps in the state of Israel, perhaps there really isn't a return from exile, but rather a collective exile, a country in a political exile from the rest of the world, an exile from the moral values of the world, from the atmosphere that shaped Judaism for the past 2,000 years. What's going on? The great medievalist Chaim Soloveitchik has argued that Orthodox Judaism has shifted from Jewishness as an identity to Jewishness as an ideology. Being Jewish is now a matter of choice, not inheritance. It's not inevitable. It's a conscious preference of joining the enclave rather than the host society. But in choosing that preference, Jewish identity, which used to be inborn, is now structured according to texts. It used to be, you could say, I remember my grandmother preparing for Passover used to put the dishes this way. But now you have to find it in a text. Did the rabbi write it in this text? Show me the text. Show me the words. That becomes now the form of instruction. The written word, the text, is the touchstone of religious authenticity that's replaced the mimesis of home and street. Now, what is text? What this textual structure does to us, especially, is to re-emphasize that Jewish women in particular are in exile. Jewish women are the ones who most often feel in exile from what is called authentic Judaism, from the texts of Judaism. But exile is also a spiritual state, a state of discomfort. But sometimes we ask ourselves, exile from what? Exile from God, from religion, from the past, from our history? Do Jews have a history? The writer Chaim Chazaz once asked. Or is our history written for us by Gentiles, by those who don't know us, but by those who have shaped our political existence through their political structures? One last word about exile. In Jewish thought, exile isn't just about Jews, it's also about God. And Ben, you alluded to the four sons of the Passover Seder. The four sons are the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who doesn't ask a question. But you know that wicked son is sometimes misunderstood. He asks, what is this service to you? To you and not to him. And people say, you see, he's excluded himself from the community. He's exiled himself from the Jewish community. But there is a commentary that says, no, it's not about him, it's about Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's about God. By not recognizing that God too is in exile, that God has gone into exile with us, that's what makes him wicked. So that's another element of what has been so central for 2,000 years, a sense of God being in exile and needing us to help redeem the world ourselves, but also God. So I'll just end with a couple of quick questions for Alan for his book. I would ask, first of all, are Israelis Jewish? I would ask, nobody's laughing at any of my, Moshe, you wrote the book on Jewish humor. What's wrong? What do we say then, Alan, to the new Jews of Zionism, to the effort to build something with Jewish hands, Jewish sweat? What do we do with the Jews who are trying to combine an exilic Polish-Jewish piety with life in Israel, where jobs and military service are required, but who claim that because of their piety they won't participate in that? What do we do about the turn to right-wing politics among Jews in exile, not only those in Israel? And isn't your book, in that respect, a moral cri de coeur? And then finally, I would have to ask, is it exile that we enjoy here, sitting here in the United States? Or is it the multicultural democracy of the United States that we're enjoying? What would you say? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Kevin Kenny is going to bring us home with his commentary. He's a professor and chair of history, professor of history and chair of the history department here at Boston College, where he teaches courses on American immigration and global migration. Professor Kenny is the author of several books on Irish and Irish-American history, including Making Sense of the Molly Maguires, The American Irish, A History, and Peaceable Kingdom Lost. His most recent book, or I think his latest book, is entitled Diaspora, A Very Short Introduction. and it examines the origins, meaning, and utility of a central concept in the study of migration, with particular reference to Jewish, African, Irish, and Asian history. He received his BA and MA from the University of Edinburgh, and an MA, MPhil, and PhD in American history from Columbia University. Please welcome Kevin Kenny.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks, Alan, for the invitation to do this. About an hour ago, I was looking at the lineup and basking comfortably in the knowledge that I would go last and could just sort of adjust my comments in light of the wisdom I had heard. Ben was about halfway through his first sentence when I realized that this might be a disadvantage to me, but I'll give you what I have. I thought actually it would be useful if I laid out the elements of Alan's argument as I understand them, because most of you haven't read the book, I assume. You may have read the review in the New York Times, and then I'll offer a few comments of my own. So At Home in Exile is presented as a powerful argument for the positive dimension of diaspora and its potential benefits to Jews everywhere, both outside and inside Israel. Alan argues against particularism, the idea of allegiance to one's own group at all costs, regardless of the consequences to others, which he associates with certain illiberal varieties of Zionism. He argues in favor of a countercurrent of Jewish universalism, whereby allegiance to one's group can serve as the foundation of a commitment to the rights of others. This is a distinction that leaves Ben cold, but precisely because he has lived through both dimensions. And Alan sees this as a real and enduring aspect of Jewish history. Diaspora, as viewed from the perspective of universalism, Alan argues, is good for the Jews. That's the subtitle, good for the Jews, in several ways. It is based on a capacity for survival that can inspire empathy with other groups who must struggle to survive in exile. It can therefore lead to, and has led to, a tangible concern with civil and political rights. It is a source of creativity based on the flowering of multiple forms of culture, imagination, and interpretation in the absence of political sovereignty. In our contemporary world, diaspora can therefore encourage a sensitivity to the global, transcending simple dichotomies of homeland and exile, center and periphery. Thinking globally in this way allows us to think of forms of belonging that de-center the territorial state in favor of a more complex model of interconnected global urban locations. In the Jewish case, this network includes New York City, Boston, London, and Los Angeles, as well as Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, without giving a priori precedence to any one location over the others. This approach transcends any standard bifurcation between Israel and the diaspora that sees the latter as somehow inferior to the former. And I suspect that Ben would be comfortable with that dimension of the argument. At Home in Exile, however, is not a simple attack on Zionism. Alan's book documents many different strands within Zionism, although they do fall into the two broad camps of particularism and universalism. He rejects what he sees as the ugliness and intolerance of particularism. He seeks to revive the universalist traditions, especially as practiced in the United States and Europe. Alan is harshly critical of particularism, but he believes that a resuscitated universalism emanating largely from today's diaspora can serve, in his words, as Israel's conscience. This is not a call to save the human race, merely one's fellow Jews, but again, I take Ben's point that that's still a heavy burden to carry. Now, that's the argument as I see it. I read the book as a historian and as somebody who's written a book about the concept of diaspora rather than an expert in Jewish studies. And in that capacity, I just want to touch briefly on three points in my comments this evening. The first concerns some historical precedents. The second is the extent to which Allen's argument on the benefits of diaspora might apply to other groups. And the third is to offer some reflections very briefly on the distinction between the diasporic and the global. The destruction of the temple in 586 BCE and the exile of the Jewish leadership to Babylon was an event of decisive significance in Jewish history. As depicted in Hebrew scripture, Babylon carries strongly negative connotations. Psalm 137, 1 through 4 conveys the sense of exile and sorrow as the children of Zion lay down by its rivers and wept. Babylon retains that connotation of exile, alienation, and despair today, not only in this particular case, but in the case of other groups who invoke that term. The members of the Rastafari movement, for example, use Babylon as another word for the West, the land of slavery. Babylon is not just a physical place, it is a condition of alienation and exclusion along the lines that Susan adverted to. And this condition is one of the central themes of Jewish history, with diaspora as the explanatory framework. Yet the fact remains that involuntary migrants settled permanently in their new hostlands. Had they not done so, no strong sense of diaspora could have developed or endured. The prophet Jeremiah advised the Jews of Babylon, "Build ye houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them, and seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof ye shall have peace." And here lay the origins of a model of diaspora that would allow those in exile to carve out a new life for themselves wherever they lived. To describe the Jewish diaspora simply as a matter of banishment and exile, therefore, would be to ignore the flourishing of Jewish culture all over the world, from Alexandria and Sardis, Antioch and Damascus in the ancient world, through the Golden Age in Spain and Portugal, through to the most recent example, the migration of more than 3 million East European and Russian Jews to the United States in the half century after 1880, with no desire to return to Russia, of all places, and little desire to join the small number of Jews who were then settling in Palestine at that time. The extraordinary accomplishments of the Jews in the United States are only the latest example, albeit on an unprecedented scale, of a diasporic culture flourishing while rooted in a particular place. Now, the extent to which that culture will continue to flourish and thereby fulfill some of the emancipatory potential that Allen assigns to it depends on two closely related considerations. The first is assimilation. To what extent is Jewishness in the United States being diluted into a form of symbolic ethnicity, conforming to the pattern of assimilation followed by other ethnic groups? Well, I would say the mere fact that scholars have been debating that question for the last 2 generations is partly an answer. Jewishness is not going away. At the same time, it's worth noting that a majority of non-Orthodox Jews in the United States today are marrying non-Jews. So that's one consideration, is assimilation. The second is anti-Semitism. Scholars point to a significant decline of anti-Semitism in the United States since World War II. They point also to a resurgence in Europe. The ability of the diaspora to fulfill the potential Allen assigns to it rests in large part on continued improvement in this respect rather than a resurgence of old hatreds. And here we'll go with Allen's optimism, the word he used at the beginning. So much for the historical background. I have 2 other points I want to make briefly. The first point concerns the extent to which diaspora, as Allen defines it, can be good for other groups who describe themselves or are described with that term. In the African case, for example, involuntary dispersal eventually gave rise, in a triumph over adversity, to just the kind of cultural dynamism and creativity that Allen celebrates. But in what sense, if any, could diaspora be good for the Palestinians? One of the central tragic ironies of contemporary history is that the partial dismantling of one diaspora led directly to the formation of another. Palestinians and their supporters today lament Israel's Independence Day as Yom al-Nakba, the day of catastrophe. Roughly 11 million people worldwide identify themselves as Palestinian. 5 million of them are permanent refugees living in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Nearly all Palestinians lack citizenship and the protection of a government. The largest Palestinian community outside the Arab world, over 300,000 strong, is in Chile. Now, diasporas originate in involuntary migration, whether conquest and captivity in the Jewish case, slavery in the African, or famine in the Irish. In the short term, diasporas are invariably good for the victors or the conquerors. In the long term, they can carry benefits to dispersed populations of the kind Alan describes. He argues that chief among these benefits in the Jewish case is the tradition of universalism. The only sense, presumably, in which diaspora could be good for the Palestinians would be if that universalism were revived and served as Israel's conscience. And Alan is not arguing other than that, as I understand him. My third and final point has to do with the diasporic and the global. One estimate commonly accepted of the number of Jews in the world today is 13.5 million. It's hard to measure that. More than 80%, Eric suggested as high as 90%, live in Israel or the United States, roughly equal numbers in both places. Most of the remainder in Europe, about 1.5 million, smaller populations in Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Africa, and elsewhere. So put another way, almost 60% of Jews today live outside Israel in what is now the diaspora. In the United States and Israel, a vocal minority of academics and activists have tried to envision a post-Zionist Jewish culture. Some of them even see the very attempt to root national identity in a territorially bounded state as an abandonment of what they value in Jewishness, as a break with 2,000 years of history. At an abstract theoretical level, I think these are fascinating arguments, they're important arguments. It does seem to me that the very open-endedness that these critics celebrate, the insistence on retaining a Jewish culture without political sovereignty, has been obviously acutely double-edged in practice. It accounts not only for the unique historical accomplishments of Jewish civilization, but also for its terrible vulnerability. And any liberal universalist approach today rests, as I emphasized earlier, on the hope that anti-Semitism is in permanent abeyance, a hope that is not widely shared in Israel. Nonetheless, Alan is tapping into a tradition without endorsing its more extreme versions that locates the virtues and accomplishments of the Jewish people precisely in dispersal, exile, and adaptation. And to the extent that diaspora still carries a negative connotation, some non-Israeli Jews today might better be described as a global rather than a diasporic people. In insisting that his people are at home in exile, Alan Wolfe places himself at the vanguard of this Jewish cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
Okay, our author has met his critics, and we'd now like to offer him a chance, if you'd like, a few minutes to respond to a few of the particular questions. Would you like to come here or sit there? You flip the switch on.
Okay?
Good.
Does this work?
Yeah.
I can't, look, these were terrific comments. I can't possibly respond to all the amazing points that were made, and I also want to leave time for questions from the audience. So I'll just try to pick sort of one theme from each of the interlocutors and try my best to comment on it or respond to it. Ben, I learned a lot about you from your talk. Known you for a long time, as you said. I was really taken by so much of what you had to offer. As I listened to you, the question that came to me is the question of why did I write this book? Why did I suddenly turn, after a long academic career of writing about everyone else, finally turn to the subject of my own upbringing? I grew up in a very secular home. I did have a bar mitzvah. And, I won't say that was the last time I've been in synagogue, but I think you could count the number of times. So, well, I go to synagogue to give talks in them. But why did I, and listening to your deep story, it struck me then in a funny kind of way. For you, I think the question of how to identify with being Jewish, even if it's a Jewish universalism, is more fraught with significance than it is for me. I've so much less invested in it that I can afford to say, oh, I like this Jewish thing. And just to jump ahead to Kevin Kenny's remarks, he talked about the concept of symbolic ethnicity, a concept that I attribute to a sociologist named Herbert Gans, who's still alive and still writing on these things. And I sort of like symbolic ethnicity. It gives you the benefits of both worlds. You have something that you can identify with, but there's no danger in it. There's no violence in it, as there has been so much violence in Ireland and in other countries that have experienced, genuine conflict over these kinds of things. So I think we come from different backgrounds in that sense. And I really appreciate what you said, because it makes me realize that, I sort of knew I was playing with a little bit of fire, but the fire I'm playing with I now think is a little larger because of what you said. And Susanna, your comments are so rich and thoughtful. At Home in Exile, we had every book. It's often hard to get titles for. I'm sure you've had that experience. I like this title. And I thought it conveyed a certain kind of sense. I didn't fully grasp, I think, the possibility that all Jews are in exile and that statehood hasn't solved the problem of exile. I do quote, one of the book was reviewed twice in the New York Times, and one of the reviewers, the president of Wesleyan University, comments that I quote Christopher Hitchens, who said before he died, after discovering that he himself had Jewish roots, and that his mother was hiding her Judaism in the English port city of Portsmouth, that Israeli Jews are not an alternative to the diaspora. They're part of it. And more I see that that's really true, that first of all, there are so many Israelis now living in the actual diaspora, something that the founders of Zionism, I don't think, ever could have imagined. And that by creating itself as a state in the Middle East, Israel automatically became part of the exilic condition because it's in exile from all the other people that are surrounding it. And I think that's a primary reason why the great promise of security that Israel seemed to offer in the 1940s and 1950s and has been achieved to a considerable degree has also been so much more precariously seeming these days. I also appreciated the reference to Avram Berg, who is a former speaker of the Israeli Knesset and the son of the leader of Israel's National Religious Party, who's become a real critic of Israeli direction and has been pretty much excluded from polite society these days. As some of you know, Nancy, I'm thinking of you, Ari Shavat, a prominent Israeli journalist, has been attracting huge audiences for his recent book on Israel. And I cite in my book an interview that Shavat had with Berg, which is very, very hostile, I must say. Essentially, Ari, why have you deserted us? Why don't you love our country the way we do? And I just found it an astonishingly example of a failure on Shavat's part to understand the multiplicities of Zionism. And that Berg was really in the spirit of Ahad Ha'am and other early Zionists, I think more than Shavat was. And so I love this concept of maybe being a globalized people. There is a paradox in that. The great American historian of Judaism, the great historian of American Judaism, Jonathan Sarna, whose wife is, of course, on our faculty here at BC, pointed out that in some ways what's been happening is not a diaspora but a consolidation. That the depopulation of Jews from the Arab lands, from everywhere essentially, that 6 cities you mentioned, for example, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, and New York, I think, and Chicago, they contain like almost all the Jews. And And Jews are, in that sense, not a global people these days. They're a very bifurcated people. About 6 million in Israel, maybe 6 million in the United States, and another million in Europe. But not in Morocco, not in Syria, not in Malaysia, and all kinds of other places. You also brought up the anti-Semitism question, which, I published this book, and almost immediately, like almost the day of publication, yet another story came out in the New York Times about French anti-Semitism and how many Jews are leaving France. And I just have to say, I've heard this story so many times. I actually think we're poised for another round of focus on what one of the heroes of my book, Simon Ravidovich, called Jews as the ever-dying people. That Jews can't accept, I think, sufficiently the security and the achievements they've made. Why don't we talk about the fact that France has had 2 Jewish premiers? Why don't we talk about the fact that Jews are just so prominent in French intellectual life? I have a friend who accuses me of insufficient sensitivity to the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And every time there's a negative story about any Jew anywhere, he sends me an email saying, see this? And then right after that, there was a story about the growing, vibrant Jewish community in, God forbid, of all places, Berlin, and there's complete silence. For my friend, this story doesn't fit his narrative. Look, anti-Semitism is a horrible, terrible thing. You read the speeches of some of the leaders of the European right or some of the more extreme Muslim critics of Israel, and they're horrifying. But is it a sort of new stage? Does it come anywhere near the Dreyfus case with official state-sponsored anti-Semitism? I just think we have to retain our optimism and retain our sense of success. I think that we, of course, not including you, but we, the Jewish people, the great temptation is to say, oh, there they go again. We'll never be at home anywhere. And I just think that's a tendency that doesn't describe the world as we know it today.
All right. Well, thank you very much. At this point, we've still got a lot of good time for conversation with the audience, and I'd like to remind those of you watching online that if you'd like to send questions via Twitter, you could do so via hashtag Jewish Diaspora. And you can also email our staffer, Evan Goldstein, evan.goldstein@bc.edu, if you'd like to ask a question. But, of course, we'd like to start here in the room. So questions, before, when you ask a question, please introduce yourself as well. Yes, sir.
The recent studies of the growth of American Jewish life have shown that the Haredi, or the ultra-Orthodox community, is growing greatly, precisely because they have a large number of children, 3 to 4 times the average of what we call, if you will, Jews who are universalists. And that's really a question. I mean, how are you going to face, how are we legally going to face the fact that perhaps within 10 to 20 years, the majority of Jews in the United States that are really viable are going to be people who in no way share universalistic values. Even today, that's the group that finds itself moving into the Republican Party, and they also vote on masse and blog, and they're being, of course, always the bid is to get their support. So that's one thing. Now, universalism in the younger generation, as you know, among the so-called millennials, is that 35% may not even identify as Jews anymore. So they're not even buying into a Jewish universalism. They're just saying it's maybe symbolic ethnicity at best. But the bottom line is that they do intermarry. They do not give their children even a secular Jewish education, let alone a religious education. So that's the first thing. That you may be not seeing the reality on the ground, which is not towards universalism. That's not it. And in Israel, I always have a problem by the whole Holocaust redemption model. And the problem is because if anyone knows anything about the history of Zionism, it began far before that. The population that it expected to have were their Eastern European compatriots, the 6 million who were destroyed. They were not expecting the Jews from Morocco. They were not expecting the Jews from the Arab lands. And what happened basically is that you have 3 major factors in Israel, I'll stop in a moment, that are not based upon democratic backgrounds. Soviet Jews came without a sense of democracy. Jews from the Arab lands, came with a sense of what the democratic values are. And the third group is the group of people who basically are moving towards the right politically and saying, if I have to make a choice between the Jewish state and the democratic state, I will choose the Jewish state. So there's a lot of doubt on my mind that this Jewish universalism is the clarion call to the future. And I'm saddened by that. And I'm really doubting that a Jewish universalism will in any way counter that, because ultimately it leads to a deracinization of the people involved. And we are going to be destroyed in America, the Jewish people, by love. A whole new phenomenon. Imagine.
All right, thank you very much. Yep. Alan, do you want to get us started?
I thought your specialty was Jewish humor. Now you offer me the most depressing account I've heard.
Well,
Well, well, a couple of things. I mean, yes, obviously Zionism preceded the Holocaust. It was the Kishinev pogroms in 1903 and 1905 that constituted the great warning sign for the early Zionists. And the Zionists like Bialik, the national poet of Israel, was so shaken by those events. He saw almost, and the complete, I mean, he wrote some actually pretty, I think, horrific poems about how Jews were allowing themselves to be slaughtered, that even bordered on anti-Semitism in his condemnation of the Eastern European Jewish passivity in the face of that. And yet the two pogroms together constituted about 8,000 Jews killed, which pales, to how you can't even compare them. So I just couldn't imagine what would have happened if something like that had seeped into the consciousness of these people. They couldn't have imagined anything that bad. Assimilation and intermarriage. These are, of course, always the subjects that tend to dominate this discussion. Jews are so convinced that the world is out to get them that they either believe that every Christian wants to kill them or every Christian wants to marry them. And it's not always clear which one's worse. You get that, you get the Orthodox rabbis saying, nothing Hitler did compares to intermarriage in terms of threatening the Jewish people. But I think we tend to forget two things in that. One is that other religions that, like Judaism, have both an ethnic and a religious component face very much the same kind of threat, and far more of a threat in that regard. I had the privilege to speak while the book was being written here in Boston and at a Jewish event, and they had as the co-speaker the Metropolitan of the Greek Orthodox Church in Boston. And listening to his tales of woes, I mean, how many second, third generation Greeks still speak Greek, are married to Greek? It just, at one point in time, it would have been absolutely forbidden for someone from the Greek Orthodox Church to attend the Russian Orthodox Church. Now any Orthodox Church, as long as it's Orthodox, will do it. And so this is a problem that many, many people face. Again, the tales of woe are so common. I try to be optimistic and view intermarriage as an opportunity as well as a threat, that it brings the messages of Judaism to an ever larger group of people. There's been a lot of studies of the children of intermarried couples, and some kids are just lost to all religion when that happens. Mostly, the most common pattern is to try to raise children in two faiths. And from the perspective of someone really committed to one, that's a horrific idea. But in my benign pluralism, raising your children with two different faiths if faith's good, two religions are better than none. So I think there is as much a challenge there as anything else. I don't know. I've lost the train of your other thoughts. But.
That's okay. We can pick up on it along the way. If any of the other panelists would like to jump in, just flip the on switch onto your microphone. No?
All right.
Okay. Okay, great. Other questions? Or short speeches disguised as questions? Yes, Judith.
There's been a fair amount of renewed interest within Christian circles about the Jewish nature of Christianity, and and a recovery of Judaism within Christianity. And I haven't read the book, but I'm wondering how this fits into your optimism, or is there a pessimism about it?
Yeah, Christian Zionism was originally British in inspiration. It actually had a great deal to do with the whole founding, or at least the kind of pro-Zionist Christians, that many of whom played a major role in foreign service in Great Britain and became advocates for Israel. But it has a much more vibrant history in this country, where many of the Christian right, who used to make no excuse whatsoever about the violent anti-Semitism that characterized their public speeches, now suddenly find themselves to be the greatest friends Israel ever had. You know, there's a kind of theological argument behind it that Israel had to be created before Jesus would come back to earth and turn everybody into a Christian. And I think the Jewish organizations that make friends with these people know that history, but there's a kind of short-term sort of alliance. Routinely, some of the most, the Reverend John Hagee, who has written some really vile things about how the Jews brought Hitler, about and so on, has received awards from all the major Jewish organizations because he's such a passionate defender of Israel. So to be Christian and to be a Zionist doesn't mean you sort of put aside your anti-Semitism. It's still there. I prefer to think of such people as people we're best off avoiding. But this is one of those cases where I think realpolitik, that is the huge number of Christian voters in this country, that if you get them voting pro-Israel, that's an advantage that overcomes any of the taints associated with the anti-Semitism.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to both comments, if I may.
Please.
Is my microphone?
Yeah, please.
So, first of all, Moshe Waldox, Rabbi Waldox. So, I would say that, in fact, you're right, that the more and more Jews are becoming ultra-Orthodox, Haredi Jews, and turning away from the universalism. Making them where they're, yes, they're multiplying, yes. And that is changing the political dimension. On the other hand, I have to say that a lot of synagogues, what should I say, they're not very Jewish, There's a kind of vulgarity. There's the synagogues themselves are in exile from Judaism, most of them, not yours. This is great. But this is a problem at both sides. But I do actually think that the situation can't continue this way, that a lot of Jews who are ultra-Orthodox also want to study, want to learn, want to go to college, want to join the world and not simply live apart from it. I think this is a brief phenomenon in history, and that's going to change. And I also think that the fact that certain conservative reforms aren't doing very well, because, that kind of Judaism is a vulgarity that people can't put up with, and that also is going to change. And that's why we have synagogues like yours, TBZ in Brookline. On the question of Jewishness of Christianity, I would say what's interesting to me when you asked that question was that, it's true, a lot of Christians are recognizing the Jewishness of Jesus, for example. There are churches that celebrate a Passover Seder, as the Last Supper. But what's interesting is the other side. That is, how many Jews are willing to actually admit to Christian influences on Judaism? Every Jew, no matter how secular, even you, Alan, I'll bet. I'll bet you light a Yortzeit candle for your parents. Do you every year? Alan.
I didn't know we were going to get into that. Yes, I do. Of course I do.
As far as you know.
My God,
Where
what kind
does
of
that
person
custom
do you
come
think
from?
I am?
Of course. So the lighting of a candle that burns for 24 hours is a memorial for a member of your family who has passed away every year on the anniversary of the death. Where did Jews get that? They got it from the Catholic Church. It became a Jewish custom in the 13th century in Spain. Fine, but Jews don't want to admit it. I think that's when we come out of exile. We come out of exile when we're willing to admit that, in fact, having lived among Christians and among Muslims has influenced us, has changed Jewish law, Jewish practice, and that's a good thing. So that would be one step in the change of exilic mentality.
Yes, Kevin and then Ben.
The first thing I wanted to say in reading Alan's work and listening to him this evening,
Can you want
Can you hear me?
make it
There you go. Just you
Yeah.
have to speak directly in.
Green. In reading Alan's work and listening to him this evening, it just reminds me of an ambition of my own, which is to grow more optimistic as I grow older. And I want to look at the optimistic side of things. With the question of assimilation, I mean, we've been presented with both sides. You could say that there's a movement away from Jewishness, and then there's a multiplication, as you put it, of the Orthodox ranks that would lead not to universalism, but to something else. Alan's more optimistic take, with multiple religions flourishing, would be to spread the universalist word in that way, rather than to see it as a dilution. That would be more compatible with what you said about multiculturalism or democracy. But actually, my question for Alan would be, whenever you write a book, you form a view of an audience. You're writing for somebody. You don't write in a vacuum, and you're writing for a group of people or a person. As you wrote this book, is there somebody you would most like to read this in your mind? What would please you most? In particular, in the potential readerships that are out there, who would you like to reach?
Well, I guess I took a real gamble because I didn't know the answer. But I just assumed that there must be a lot of people out there, kind of like me, that are coming at some point in their lives to think about why they took certain paths and why other paths were closed to them. And I thought that, I mean, it is a very personal book. As Ben said, there's this personal afterword in which I talk about why I came to write this book. And I guess that's the reason. If you ever, I mean, writing a book is such a kind of narcissistic thing to do in the first place. You have to believe that you have something to say. And then to write a book about that grows out of your own past experiences, then doubly narcissistic. But since I don't think I suffer from that particular psychological condition, although I no doubt suffer from others, I'd like to think that there are a lot of people just questioning, searchers, as they're sometimes called, and maybe I could reach them. The other way to answer your question is what kind of what do you expect? What kind of knowledge do you expect your audience to have? And I've always tried to write books that are rooted in research I do, but that are not written for other academic specialists. And in this case, there's this field called Jewish Studies, and there are departments at so many universities, and there's so many fabulous scholars at all of them who have so much more knowledge than I do, but I'm also persuaded that people can get so wrapped up in their specialties that they lose a larger picture. And so I guess that's what I was trying to do.
Go ahead, Ben.
I just want to add a gloss to Susanna's story about the Earthside candle and its origins in 13th century Catholicism. I like Earthside candles for just about everybody who dies. I had one burning for Father Bill Neenan, who many of you knew, passed away just about a month ago. And the Jews who worked for me, who came into my office, knew exactly what it was, and they just asked me who. And the Catholics who came in had no idea why I was lighting a candle, and said, "Why are you lighting a candle?" Further proof, as though we needed, of a God who works in irony and not history.
Any final questions tonight? We have, while you're formulating last questions, I'd like to take the opportunity to invite you to a reception following this. We'll have food and drink to continue our conversation as well. But if there's last questions, we could do one more question.
I have one. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Yes, sir.
Comment I was going to make is I just finished reading a 650-page biography of Louis Brandeis, the Rotsky book. And it's very fascinating about this because he was not religious. He only came to some aspects of Zionism later in his life. And it's kind of interesting because he was a brilliant man. He made a lot of money because he was so smart. But this book talks about a lot of the things that he did through his family and whatnot, that affected people. And Brandeis is really a rather fascinating man. He was brilliant, and he made a lot of money practicing law when nobody made money practicing law. Back in the early 1900s, late 1880s, 1900s, he was making big bucks. It's not just, of course, he's the guy that school of law came was named for. He wrote a lot of very interesting stuff, and I just mention that because there's a lot out there about him and about his scholarship.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. I get invited from time to time to speak in Christian churches, and I was once invited to talk at a Episcopal Church of England church in Louisville, Kentucky, and I began by saying how delighted I was to be in the birthplace of one of the great religious figures after whom a university in suburban Boston is named, and nobody in the audience knew that I was talking about Louis Brandeis, who was indeed a great man. I also remember I got into a fairly severe argument with a very, very conservative Zionist, whose name will go unmentioned in this company, and who said, "What about Brandeis? You know, he was a great Zionist." And that gave me the opportunity to say what I tried to say earlier. There were many kinds of Zionists. And in the book, I talk about two different traditions in American Zionism specifically, in the context of the fact that American Zionism was looked on with great disdain by European Zionists. They were the real Zionists, and anything in America couldn't be important. But there were a lot of directions that Brandeis could have gone in, and it's only counterfactual history at its worst to say Brandeis was a Zionist, Israel was created after he died, therefore Brandeis would have been a big supporter of Israel. History doesn't work that way, I think. I think Brandeis would have been very supportive of the idea of Israel and quite critical of its actual policies.
Susanna?
I agree, there are different kinds of Zionisms, and it also does seem to me that when you look at something like the Balfour Declaration, it's Christian Zionism that ultimately had the most power. Lord Balfour's Christian Zionism rather than Chaim Weizmann's Jewish Zionism. But I think what concerns me here is that what we see developing today is not so much a political conflict between Israel and Palestinians. What worries me is the racism that's developing and that's overtaking the conflict. And I would say that's something that we all need to worry about. And in that sense, Israel is no different. Israel is in exile with us, let's say, by being mired in these kinds of racist, horribly racist thoughts and articulations, even from political leaders. I just have to say one other thing, Alan. One of the great things that's happened in American Judaism is that women are now ordained rabbis. That is a great accomplishment. And that didn't come from Israel. That came from the United States. And I think that's American Judaism's great contribution to the world, that women now have a place to say Kaddish, to be called to the Torah, to be rabbis. Yeah. So.
And may I say, the rabbi who introduced the idea of women serving as clergy within the conservative Jewish tradition gave a speech here in Boston in the 1950s called The Blessings of Assimilation. And I was originally going to use it as the title of my book.
All right. I'd like to thank the staff at the Bosley Center who helped put this together, and the staff at Front Row for broadcasting this, and of course, most especially to our speakers. If you've been intrigued tonight or provoked, and I hope you have been, circle back at the bookstore table at the end and pick up a copy of Alan's new book on a steep discount, ready for reading this evening, downloading immediately into your hand as you leave this room. But please, and stick around for a reception after. Please join me in thanking the panelists, and especially Alan Wolf.